Greetings, everybody. GleeCon here again with another episode of Lore of Warcraft. When we left off, we had some dark time. A couple chapters ago, we had some dark, dire straits for Verisa and I always Falstad, the Wild Hammer Dwarf. They were in some quicksand trapped. And then we also had Rhonin making his way through Goblin Zeppelin and landing at the mountains. And meanwhile, Deathwing is manipulating people left and right. So stay a while and listen to this one. This is chapter 14 of the novel, The Day of the Dragon. Coffee's very hot right now. Baby sips. Krasus slept deeper than he had ever had, even as a small hatchling. He slept the sleep halfway between dreaming and something else, that eternal slumber from which not even the mightiest conqueror could awake. He slept knowing that each hour that passed slid him nearer and nearer to that sweet oblivion. So we're rhapsodizing here, poetic. And if you don't remember, Krasus drank like this tiny little speck of poison, because he wants to be able to meet up with Ysera, which is the last dragon aspect he has attempted to co-opt into his plan. And while he slept, the dragon mage dreamed. The first visions were murky ones, simple images from the sleeper's subconscious. However, they were soon followed by more distinct and much starker apparitions. Winged figures, both draconic and otherwise, fluttered about, seeming to scatter in panic. A looming man in black mocked him from a distance. A child raced along a winding, sun-drenched hill, a child who suddenly transformed into a twisted, undead thing of evil. Troubled by the meanings of these dreams, even in the depths of his slumber, the wizard shifted uneasily. As he did, he dropped deeper yet, entering a realm of pure darkness that both smothered and comforted him. And in that realm, a voice, a soft yet commanding voice, spoke to the desperate dragon mage.
You would sacrifice anything for her, would you not, Cordial Straws?
In his sanctum, Krasus' lips moved as he mouthed a reply.
I would give myself, if that is what it takes to free her. Poor, loyal Cordial Straws.
A shape formed in the darkness, a shape that fluctuated with each breath of the sleeping figure. In his dreams, a drifting Krasus tried to reach for that shape, but it vanished just as he almost caught it. In his mind, it had been Alexstrasza.
You slip quicker and quicker toward the final rest, brave one. Is there something you would ask of me before that happens?
Again his lips moved.
Only that you help her. Nothing for yourself. Your fading life, perhaps. Those who have the audacity to drink to death should be rewarded with a full goblet of his finest vintage.
The darkness seemed to be pulling him in. Krasus found it hard to breathe, hard to think. The temptation to simply turn over and accept the comforting blanket of oblivion grew stronger. Yet he forced himself to reply.
Her. All I ask is for her.
Suddenly he felt himself dragged upward, dragged to a place of color and light, a place where it became possible to breathe again, to think again. Images assailed him, images not from his own dreams, but from the dreams of others. He saw the wishes and wants of humans, dwarves, elves, and even orcs and goblins. He suffered their nightmares and savored their sweet sensations. The images were legion, yet as each passed him by, Krasus immediately found it impossible to recall them, just as he found it so hard to recall even his own dreams. In the midst of this flowing landscape, another vision formed. However, while all around it moved as mist, this one retained a shape, more or less, that grew to overwhelm the small figure of the wizard. A graceful draconic form, half substance, half imagination, spread its wings as if waking. Hints of faded green, such as seen in a forest before the setting of night, spread across the torso of the Leviathan. Krasus looked up, prepared to meet the dragon's eyes, and saw that they were closed, as if in sleep. However, he had no doubt that the mistress of dreams perceived him all too well.
Such a sacrifice will I not demand from you, Cordial Straws. You who have always been a most interesting dreamer.
The edges of the dragon's mouth curled up slightly.
A most intriguing dreamer.
Krasus sought to find stable footing, to find any footing, but the ground around him remained malleable, almost liquid. He was forced to float, a position that left him feeling wanting.
I thank you, Ysera. Ever polite, ever diplomatic, even to my consorts, who have in my name rejected your desires more than once. They did not understand the situation fully,
he countered.
You mean I did not understand the situation fully?
Ysera drifted back, her neck and wings rippling as if reflected in a suddenly disturbed pool. Ever her eyelids remained shut, but her great visage focused quite distinctly on the intruder to her realm.
It is not so simple a matter to free your beloved Alexstrasza, and even I cannot say if the cost is worth it. Is it not better to let the world run its course, to do as it will? If the giver of life is to be freed, will it not happen of its own accord?
Her apathy, the apathy of all three of the aspects he had visited, set the dragon mage's mind afire with anger.
And is Deathwing truly to be the culmination of the world's course, then? He certainly will be if none of you do anything but sit back and dream.
The wings folded in.
Mention not that one,
Krasus pushed.
Why, Lady of Dreams, does he give you nightmares?
Although the lid stayed tight, Ysera's eyes surely held some dire emotion.
He is one whose dreams I will never enter again. He is one who is quite possibly more terrible in his sleep than even waking.
The beleaguered wizard did not pretend to understand the last. All that concerned him was the fact that none of these great powers could summon up the wherewithal to make it stand. True, thanks to the demon soul, they were not what they had once been, but still they wielded terrible power. Yet it appeared that all three felt that the age of the dragon had passed, and that even if they could alter the future, it would not be worth dragging themselves out of their self-imposed stupors.
I know that you and yours still circulate among the younger races, Ysera. I know that you still influence the dreams of the humans, elves, and, to a point, Corielstrasz, there are limits to even my domain. But you have not given up entirely on the world, then, have you? Unlike Malagos and Nosdormu, you do not hide in madness or the relics of times past. After all, are not dreams also of the future? As much as they are the past, you would do well to remember that.
The faint image of a human woman holding up a new baby drifted by. The brief glimpse of a young boy doing epic battle with childish monsters of his own, imagining, flickered into and out of existence. Krasus momentarily surveyed the various dreams forming and dissipating around him. As many dark as there were those of a lighter nature, but that was how it had always been. A balance. Yet in his mind, his queen's continued captivity and Deathwing's determination to wrest the world from the younger races upset that balance. There would be no more dreams, no more hopes, if both situations were not rectified.
With or without your help, Ysera, I will go on. I must. You are certainly welcome to do so.
The dream dragon's form wavered. Krasus turned away from her, ignoring the intangible images that scattered in his wake.
Then either send me back to my sanctum or drop me into the abyss. Perhaps it would be best if I do not live to see the fate of the world, and what becomes of my queen.
He expected Ysera to send him back to the arms of oblivion so that he would no longer be able to harp on the subject of his Alexstrasza to either her or any of the other aspects. Instead, the dragon mage felt a gentle touch on his shoulder, an almost tentative touch. Turning, Krasus found himself facing a slim, pale woman, beautiful but ethereal. She stood clad in a flowing gown of pale green gossamer, a veil partially obscuring her lower features. In some ways she reminded him of his queen, and yet not. The eyes of the woman were closed.
Poor, struggling Corielstrasz.
Her mouth did not move, but Krasus knew the voice was for hers, Ysera's voice. A pensive expression formed on the pale face.
You would do anything for her.
He did not understand why she bothered to repeat what they both knew already. Krasus again turned from the Lady of Dreams, searching for some path by which he could escape this unreal domain.
Do not go yet, Corielstrasz.
And why not? He demanded, turning back. Ysera stared at him, eyes fully open. Krasus froze, unable not to stare back at those eyes. They were the eyes of everyone he had ever known, ever loved. They were eyes that knew him, knew every bit about him. They were blue, green, red, black, golden, every color that eyes could be. They were even his own.
I will consider what you have said.
He could scarcely believe her. You will. She raised a hand, silencing him.
I will consider what you have said. No more, no less for now.
And if you find you agree with me,
then I will endeavor to convince Malygos and Nosdormu of your quest, and from then I can promise nothing, even then.
It was more than Krasus had come with, even more than he had hoped for at this point. Perhaps it would come to nothing, but it at least gave him hope to carry into battle.
I thank you. I have done nothing for you yet, except kept your dreams alive.
The brief smile that crossed Ysera's lips had a regretful tinge to it. He started to thank her again, wanting her to understand that even this much would give him the strength he needed to go on, but suddenly Ysera seemed to drift away from him. Krasus reached for her, but the distance already proved too great, and when he sought to step forward, she only moved away more swiftly. Then it occurred to him that she of the dreaming had not moved. He had.
Sleep well and good, poor Corielstrasz,
came her voice. The slim, pale figure wavered, then dissipated completely.
Sleep well, for in the battle you seek to fight, you will need all your strength and more.
He tried to speak, but even his dream voice would not work. Darkness descended upon the dragon mage, the comforting darkness of slumber.
And do not undervalue those you think only pawns.
The mountain fortress of the orcs proved not only to be more immense than even Rhonin had supposed, but more confusing. Tunnels that he expected would bring him toward his goal would suddenly turn off in different directions, even often rising instead of descending. Some ended for no good reason that he could decipher. One such tunnel forced him to backtrack for more than an hour, not only stealing precious time but depleting his already flagging strength. It did not help at all that Deathwing had not spoken to him once in all that time. While Rhonin in no way trusted the Black Dragon, at least he knew that Deathwing would have guided him to the captive Leviathan. What could have drawn the attention of the Dark One away? In an unlit corridor, the weary mage finally sat down to rest. He had with him a small water sack given to him by the hapless goblins, and from this Rhonin took a sip. After that, Rhonin leaned back, believing that a few minutes' relaxation would enable him to clear his mind and allow him to better traverse the passages again. Did he really imagine that he could free the Dragon Queen? The doubts had increased more and more as he tried to wend his way through the mountain. Had he come here just to commit some grand suicide? His life would not bring back those who had died, and in truth they had all made choices of their own. How had he ever dreamt of such an insane quest? Thinking back, Rhonin recalled the first time the subject had come up. Forbidden to take part in the activities of the Kirin Tor after the debacle of his last mission, the young wizard had spent his days brooding, seeing no one and eating little. Under the conditions of his probation, no one had been allowed to see him either, which had made it more surprising when Krasus had materialized before him, offering his support in Rhonin's efforts to return to the ranks. Rhonin had always thought that he needed no one, but Krasus had convinced him otherwise. The Master Wizard had discussed his younger counterpart's dire situation in great detail, to the point where Rhonin had openly asked for his aid. Somehow, the topic of dragons had arisen, and from there, the story of Alexstrasza, the crimson behemoth held captive by the orcs, forced to breed savage beasts for the glory of the Horde. Even though the main element of the Horde itself had been shattered, so long as she remained a prisoner, the orcs in Cosmodan would continue to wreak havoc on the Alliance, killing countless innocents. It had been at that juncture that the notion to free the dragon had occurred to Rhonin, a notion so fantastic that he felt only he could have devised it. It had made perfect sense at the time. Redeem himself, or die trying, in a scheme that would be forever spoken of among his brethren. Krasus had been so very impressed. In fact, Rhonin now recalled that the Elder Mage had spent much time with him, working out details and encouraging the red-haired spellcaster. Rhonin freely admitted to himself now that perhaps he would have dropped the idea if not for his patron's urging. In some ways it seemed as if the quest had been more Krasus's than his own. Of course, what would the faceless counselor achieve by sending his protege off on such a mission? If Rhonin succeeded, some credit might go to the one who had believed in him, but if he failed, what good would that do to Krasus? Rhonin shook his head. If he kept asking himself questions such as these, soon he would come to believe that his patron had actually been the force behind this quest, that he had somehow used his influence to make the younger wizard want to journey to these hostile lands. Absurd. A sudden noise nearly brought Rhonin to his feet, and he realized that somewhere in the course of his thinking he had drifted off to sleep. The wizard pressed himself against the wall, waiting to see who had passed in the darkened corridor. Surely the orcs knew that the tunnel ended. Could they have come here specifically in search of him? Yet the noise, barely discernible as muttered conversation, slowly faded away. The wizard realized that he had been the victim of the complex acoustics of the cavern system. The orcs he had heard likely were several levels away from him. Could he follow those sounds, though? With growing hope, Rhonin moved cautiously in the direction from which he believed the conversation had come. Even if it had not exactly originated from that location, at least the echoes might eventually lead him to where he hoped to go. How long he had slept, Rhonin could not say, but as he journeyed along, he heard more and more sounds, almost as if Grim Batol had just awakened. The orcs seemed to be in the midst of a flurry of activity which presented the mage with something of a problem. Now there came too many noises from too many directions. Rhonin did not want to accidentally step into the practice quarters of the warriors or even their mess hall. All he wanted was the chamber where the Dragon Queen lay prisoner. Then a draconic roar cut through the sounds, a high roar that died quickly. Rhonin had already heard such cries before, but had not thought about them. Now he cursed himself for a fool. Would not all the dragons be kept in the same general region? At the very worst, following the cries would at least get him nearer to some beast, and then perhaps he could find the trail to the Queen's chamber from there. For a time he wended his way through the tunnels with little problem, most of the orcs seemingly far away, at work on some great project. Briefly, the wizard wondered if Grim Batol planned for battle. By now the Alliance had to be pressing the orc forces in northern Cosmodon. Grim Batol would need to support their brethren up there if the Horde hoped to drive the humans and their allies back. If so, the activity would work to Ronin's advantage. Not only would the orcs' minds be occupied by this, but there would be less of them. Surely every handler with a trained mount would be in the sky soon on the way to the north. Encouraged, Rhonin set a more daring pace, a more certain one, which but seconds later nearly sent him stumbling into the very arms of a pair of huge orc warriors. They were fortunately even more stunned to see him than he was them. Rhonin immediately raised his left hand, muttering a spell that he had hoped to save for more dire circumstances. The nearest of the orcs, his ugly tusked face twisting into a berserker rage, reached for the axe slung on his back. Rhonin's spell caught him directly in the chest, throwing the massive warrior hard against the nearest rock wall. As the orc struck the wall, he melded into the very rock. Briefly, the outline of his form remained behind, mouth still open in rage, but then even that faded into the wall, leaving no trace of the creature's savage end. "You scum!" roared the second, his axe now in hand. He took a heavy swing at Rhonin, chipping off bits of stone as the wizard managed to duck out of the way. The orc lumbered forward, bulky, dull green form filling the narrow corridor. A necklace of dried, wrinkled fingers, human, elven, and otherwise, dangled before Ronin's eyes, a collection to which his foe no doubt wished to add him. The orc swung again, this time coming perilously near to severing the mage in two, lengthwise. Rhonin stared at the necklace again, a grim idea in mind. He pointed at the necklace and gestured. His spell briefly made the orc pause, but when the savage warrior saw no visible effect, he laughed scornfully at the pitiful little human. "Come, I make it quick for you, wizard!" But as he raised his axe, a scratching sensation forced the orc to look down at his chest. The fingers on his necklace, more than 24 strong, had moved to his throat. He dropped the axe and tried to pull them away, but they had already dug in tight. The orc began to cough as the fingers formed a macabre hand of sorts, a hand cutting off his air. Rhonin scrambled back as the orc began to swing about wildly, trying to peel away the avenging digits. The wizard had intended the spell only as a diversion while he came up with something more final, but the severed fingers seemed to have taken the opportunity to heart. Vengeance? Even as a mage, Rhonin could not believe that the spirits of the warriors slain by this orc had somehow urged the fingers to this grand effort. It had to be the potency of the spell itself. Surely, it had to be. Whether vengeful ghosts or simply magic, the enchanted fingers did their terrible work with seeming eagerness. Blood covered much of the orc's upper chest as nails tore into the softer throat. The monstrous warrior collapsed to his knees, eyes so desperate that Rhonin finally had to look away. A few seconds later, he heard the orc gasp, then a heavy weight fell to the tunnel floor. The massive berserker lay in a bloody heap, the fingers still dug deep into his neck. Daring to touch one of the severed digits, Rhonin found no movement, no life. The fingers had performed their task and now had returned to their previous state, just as his spell had intended. And yet... Shaking off such thoughts, Rhonin hurried past the corpse. He had nowhere to put the body and no time to think about it. Before long, someone would discover the truth, but the wizard could not help that. Rhonin had to concern himself only with the Dragon Queen. If he did manage to free her, perhaps she would at least carry him off to safety. In that truly lay his only possibility of escape. He managed to traverse the next few tunnels without interruption, but then found himself heading toward a brightly lit corridor from which the babble of voices grew loud and strong. Moving with more caution, Rhonin edged up to the intersection, peering around the corner. What he had taken for a corridor had proven to actually be the mouth of a vast cavern that opened up to the right, a cavern in which scores of orcs worked hard at loading up wagons and preparing draft animals, all as if they intended some long journey from which they would not likely soon return. Had he been correct about the battle north? If so, why did it seem every orc intended to depart? Why not simply the dragons and their handlers? It would take far too long for these wagons to reach Dun Algaz. Two orcs came into sight, the pair carrying some great weight between them. Clearly they would have preferred to put down whatever it was they carried, but for some reason dared not do so. In fact, Rhonin thought that they took special care with their burden, almost as if it were made of gold. Seeing that no one looked in his direction, the wizard took a step forward in order to better study what the orcs so valued. It was round, oval, and a bit rough in outer appearance, and almost scaly. In fact, it reminded Rhonin of nothing more than an egg. A dragon's egg, to be precise. Quickly his gaze shifted to some of the other wagons. Sure enough, he now realized that several of them bore eggs in some stage of development, from smoother, nearly round ones to others even more scaled than the first, eggs clearly near to hatching. With the dragon so essential to the orcs' fading hopes, why would they be risking such precious cargo on such a journey? Human. The voice in his head nearly made Rhonin shout. He flattened against the wall, then quickly slipped back into the tunnel. Finally certain that none of the orcs could see him, Rhonin seized the medallion around his neck and gazed at the black crystal in the center. Sure enough, it now glowed slightly. Human. Rhonin. Where are you? Did Deathwing not know? I'm in the very midst of the orc fortress, he whispered. I was looking for the Dragon Queen's chamber. You found something else, though. There was a glimpse of it. What was it? For some reason, Rhonin did not want to tell Deathwing. It's only the orcs at battle practice. I nearly walked in on them without realizing it. His response was followed by a lengthy silence. So lengthy, in fact, that he nearly thought Deathwing had broken the link. Then, in a very even tone, the dragon returned. I wish to see it. It's nothing. Before Rhonin could say another word, his body suddenly rebelled against him, turning back toward the cavern and the many, many orcs. The outraged spellcaster tried to protest, but this time even his mouth would not work for him. Deathwing brought him to the spot where he had last stood, then made the wizard's right hand hold up the medallion. Rhonin guessed that Deathwing observed all through the ebony crystal. At battle practice, I see. And is this how they practice their retreating? He could not reply to the Leviathan's mocking retort, nor did he think that Deathwing really cared if he did. The dragon forced him to stay in the open while the medallion surveyed everything. Yes, I see. You may return to the tunnel now. His body suddenly his own again, Rhonin slipped out of sight, thankful that the orcs had been so busy with their task that no one had chanced to look up. He leaned against a wall, breathing heavily and realizing that he had been far more frightened of discovery than he would have thought possible. So evidently Rhonin was not as suicidal as he had once imagined. You follow the wrong path. You must go back to the previous intersection. Deathwing made no comment about Rhonin's attempt at subterfuge, which worried the wizard more than if the dragon had. Surely Deathwing too pondered the orcs' moving of the eggs, unless he knew something about it already. How could that be possible, though? Certainly no one here would relay that information to him. The orcs feared and despised the Black Dragon at least as much as, if not more than, they did the entire Lordaeron alliance. Despite those concerns, he immediately followed Deathwing's instructions, backtracking along the corridor until he came to the intersection in question. Rhonin had ignored it earlier, thinking its narrow appearance and lack of lighting meant it had little significance. Surely the orcs would have kept any tunnel of importance better lit. "This way," he whispered. "Yes." How the dragon knew so much about the cavern system continued to bother Rhonin. Surely Deathwing had not gone wandering through the tunnels, not even in his human guise. Could he have done so in the form of an orc? Possibly so, and yet that too did not seem the answer. "The second tunnel on your left. You will take that one next." Deathwing's directions appeared flawless. Rhonin waited for one mistake, one error that would indicate the dragon guessed, at least in part. No such mistake occurred. Deathwing knew his way around the orc sanctum as good as, if not better than, the bestial warriors themselves. Finally, after what felt like hours more of traveling, the voice abruptly commanded, "Cease." Rhonin paused, although he had no clue as to what concerned Deathwing enough to demand a stop. "Wait." A few moments later, voices from down the tunnel carried to the wizard. "Where were you? Where you were? I've questions for you. Questions." "Most sorry, my Grand Commander, most sorry. It could not be helped. The voices faded away, just as Rhonin strained to hear more. He knew one to be that of an orc, evidently that of the one in charge of the fortress. I messed up the voices. But the other speaker had to be of quite a different race. A goblin. Deathwing made use of goblins. Could that be how he knew so much about this vast lair? Had one of the goblins here also been serving the Dark One? He would have liked to have followed and heard more of the conversation, but the dragon suddenly ordered him on again. Rhonin knew that if he did not obey, Deathwing might very well make him march. At least while Rhonin had control of his limbs, he could still feel as if he had some choice in matters. Crossing the tunnel down which the orc commander and the goblin had gone, Rhonin descended through a deep tunnel toward what seemed the very bowels of the mountain. Surely now he had to be near the Dragon Queen. In fact, he almost swore that he could hear the breathing of a giant, and since there were no true giants in Grim Batol, that left only dragons. 2 corridors ahead. Turn right. Follow until you see the opening to your left." Deathwing said no more. Rhonin again obeyed his instructions, quickening the pace as much as possible. His nerves were on edge. How much longer would he have to wander through this mountain? He turned right, followed the next passage on and on. From the dragon's simplistic instructions, Rhonin had expected to come across the opening mentioned in fairly quick time, but even after what had to be half an hour, he had seen nothing, not even another intersection. Twice he had asked Deathwing if he would soon arrive, but his unseen guide remained silent. Then, just as the wizard felt ready to give up, he saw a light. A dim one, to be sure, but definitely a light, and on the left side of the corridor. Hopes renewed, Rhonin hurried toward it as quickly as he could without making much noise. For all he knew, a dozen orcs stood guard around the Dragon Queen. He had spells ready, but hoped they could be preserved for other more desperate moments. "Halt!" Deathwing's voice reverberated through his head, nearly causing Rhonin to collide with the nearest wall. He flattened against it instead, certain that some sentinel had discovered him. Nothing. The passage remained empty of any but himself. "Why did you call out?" he whispered to the medallion. "Your destination lies before you, but the way may be guarded by more than flesh." Magic? He had thought of that already, but the dragon had not given him any chance to carefully check for himself. "And centuries of magical origin. There is a quick way to discover the truth. Hold out the medallion before you as you move toward the entrance." What about the guards of flesh and blood? I still have to worry about them. He could hear the Dark One's growing irritation. "All will be known, human." Certain that at the very least Deathwing wanted him to reach Alexstrasza, Rhonin held the medallion before him and slowly edged forward. "I detect only minor spells. Minor to one such as I, that is," the dragon informed him as he neared. "I will deal with them." The black crystal suddenly flared, almost causing the startled mage to lose his hold. "The protective spells have been eradicated." A pause. "There are no sentries inside. They would not need them even without magical spells. Alexstrasza is thoroughly chained and bolted to her surroundings. The orcs have been quite efficient. She is completely secure." "I should go in?" "I would be disappointed if you did not." Rhonin found Deathwing's phrasing slightly curious, but did not think long on it, more concerned with the hope of at last facing the Dragon Queen. He wished Verisa could have been here now, then wondered why that would so please him. Perhaps even thoughts of the silvery-tressed elf faded as he stepped into the entranceway and beheld for the first time the gargantuan red behemoth, Alexstrasza. and found her staring back an emotion in her reptilian eyes that seemed to him akin to fear, but not for herself. "No!" she rumbled as best as the brace around her throat enabled her. "Step back!" At the same time, Deathwing's voice, its tone triumphant, uttered, "Perfect!" A flash of light surrounded the wizard. Every fiber of his being shook as some monstrous force ripped through him. The medallion slipped from his suddenly limp fingers. As he collapsed, he heard Deathwing repeat the single word, laughing afterward. "Perfect!" Alright, so I wonder where that, golem, that fire golem or whatever it is, where that thing's got to. And I feel like when you leave on a cliffhanger with some people dying in quicksand, this is quite a lot of chapters that they're letting go by before we find out what happens to them. You know they can't be dead. Alright, we got another episode in the pipe, 5x5. We're 2/3 of the way done with this book now. I thank everybody so much for watching and listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time on Lore of Warcraft.